Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to introduce our guest this evening. Called a gorgeous stylist, capturing the subtle flutterings of consciousness better than any writer alive, Colm Tóibín is the author of an imposing list of novels, short stories, essays, plays, poetry, and criticism. His novels, The Master and The Testament of Mary, were shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and Brooklyn was adapted into the BAFTA Award-winning film of the same name. In House of Names, Toibin brings a modern sensibility and sympathy to the story of the mother of all dysfunctional families, Clytemnestra, and the insidious ravages of revenge and distrust. In his Washington Post review, Ron Charles says Toibin creates the arresting, hushed scenes for which he's so well known, just as effectively as he whips up murders that compete pint for spilled pint with those immortal Greek playwrights. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Colm Tóibín back to the Free Library.
Thanks very much for coming. I need to say at the beginning that I didn't make up this story, I'm not responsible for it. It's the story of this family. And it starts here with the idea of Agamemnon wanting the winds to change. And he appeals to the gods to change the wind. And the gods say, we'll change the wind if you sacrifice your daughter, Iphigenia. He sends for his wife, who is Clytemnestra, to bring their daughter, Iphigenia, with her for a wedding, that she's going to marry the warrior Achilles, and bring the boy, their son, Orestes as well. For good measure, for no particular reason, although he is a good reason once they're in this novel. When they appear, they spend weeks getting ready, all the clothes for the wedding. They bring women with them so they can be dressed properly for the wedding. There's a lot of excitement. They leave Electra, their other child, Clytemnestra and Agamemnon's other daughter, at home to look after things. And they arrive, and it's a picture. Clytemnestra describes it as a sort of picture of happiness. There it is, the son, the little boy, he's about 8, who's been desperate to show his father his prowess at sword fighting, being picked up by his father, and his father, Agamemnon, hugging his daughter Iphigenia, and Clytemnestra standing there watching. And he just doesn't have the courage to tell her what he has in store for her. And in a way, he's caught, as perhaps people not too far away from here at the moment are caught, in a strange embrace where they know what they should do and they know what they will do, and the two things are different. Maybe happens to us all at various times in our lives, but Agamemnon knows that he really must save his daughter. But he knows that the men want the wind to change, and he knows he'll give in to their pressure, and he will actually do his worst. And so Clytemnestra does anything she can to stop this happening. When she fails, what she does is that she decides when he returns from the war, she will murder him in retaliation. And she plans this very, very carefully. She takes a lover, Aegisthus, to help her with this. She plans out each moment of it. And this novel opens with the idea that once she has begun to use violence, that the violence has sort of taken over her imagination, that the genie is out of the bottle, as it were. The spiral has begun, or the spiral is continuing. And so this is the opening of the book. It's in the aftermath of the murder of Agamemnon, who's come back from the war. And he's come back with Cassandra, sort of a beautiful slave who he's captured, but he's brought back clearly as his lover. And, of course, Clytemnestra murders her as well. Just takes a few sentences, that bit. I have been acquainted with the smell of death the sickly, sugary smell that wafted in the wind towards the rooms in this palace. It is easy now for me to feel peaceful and content. I spend my morning looking at the sky and the changing light. The bird song begins to rise as the world fills with its own pleasures, and then as day wanes, the sound too wanes and fades. I watch as the shadows lengthen. So much has slipped away, but the smell of death lingers. Maybe the smell has entered my body and been welcomed there like an old friend come to visit. The smell of fear and panic. The smell is here like the very air is here. It returns in the same way as light in the morning returns. It is my constant companion. It has put life into my eyes, eyes that grew dull with waiting, but are not dull now, eyes that are alive now with brightness. I gave orders that the bodies should remain in the open under the sun a day or two until the sweetness gave way to stench. And I liked the flies that came, their little bodies, perplexed and brave, buzzing after their feast, upset by the continuing hunger they felt in themselves, a hunger that I had come to know too and had come to appreciate. We are all hungry now. Food merely whets our appetite, it sharpens our teeth. Meat makes us ravenous for more meat, as death is ravenous for more death. Murder makes us ravenous, fills the soul with satisfaction that is fierce and then luscious enough to create a taste for further satisfaction. A knife piercing the soft flesh under the ear with intimacy and precision, and then moving across the throat as soundlessly as the sun moves across the sky, with greater speed and zeal, and then his dark blood flowing with the same inevitable hush as dark night falls on familiar things. They cut her hair before they dragged her to the place of sacrifice. My daughter had her hands tied tight behind her back, the skin on the wrists raw with the ropes and her ankles bound. Her mouth was gagged to stop her cursing her father, her cowardly, two-tongued father. Nonetheless, her muffled screams were heard when she finally realized that her father really did mean to murder her, that he did mean to sacrifice her life for his army. They'd cropped her hair with haste and carelessness. One of the women managed to cut into the skin around my daughter's skull with a rusty blade, and when Iphigenia began her curse, that is when a man tied an old cloth around her mouth so that her words could not be heard. I'm proud that she never ceased to struggle, that never once, not for 1 second, despite the ingratiating speech she had made, did she accept her fate. She did not give up trying to loosen the twine around her ankles or the ropes around her wrists so that she could get away from them, or stop trying to curse her father so that he would feel the weight of her contempt. No one is willing now to repeat the words she spoke in the moments before they muffled her voice. But I know what those words were. I taught them to her. They were words I made up to shrivel her father and his followers with their foolish aims. They were words that announced what would happen to him and those around him once the news spread of how they dragged our daughter, the proud and beautiful Iphigenia, to that place, how they pulled her through the dust to sacrifice her so that they might prevail in their war. In that last second as she lived, I'm told that she screamed aloud so that her voice pierced the hearts of those who heard her. Her screams as they murdered her were replaced by silence and by scheming. When Agamemnon, her father, returned, and I fooled him into thinking that I would not retaliate, I waited and I watched for signs and smiled and opened my arms to him, and I had a table here prepared for food for the fool. I was waiting, wearing the special scent that excited him, scent for the fool. I was ready as he was not, the hero home in glorious victory, the blood of his daughter on his hands, but his hands washed now as though free of all stain, his hands white, his arms outstretched to embrace his friends, his face all smiles, the great soldier who would soon, he believed, hold up a cup in celebration and put rich food into his mouth, his gaping mouth, relieved that he was home. I saw his hands clench in sudden pain, clench in the grim, shocked knowledge that at last it had come to him. And in his own palace, and in the slack time when he was sure he would enjoy the old stone bath and the ease to be found there. That was what inspired him to go on, he said. The thought that this was waiting for him, healing water and spices and soft, clean clothes and familiar air and sounds. He was like a lion as he laid his muzzle down, all his roaring all done, his body limp and all thought of danger far from his mind. I smiled and said that yes, I too had thought of the welcome I would make for him. He had filled my waking life and my dreams, I told him. I dreamed of him rising all cleansed from the perfumed water of the bath. I told him his bath was being prepared as the food was being cooked, as the table was being laid, as his friends were gathering. And he must go there now, I said. He must go to the bath. He must bathe in the relief of being home. Yes, home. That is where the lion came. I knew what to do with the lion once he came home. I had spies to tell me. I had spies to tell me when he would come back. Men lit each fire that gave the news to further hills when other men lit fires to alert me. It was the fire that brought the news, not the gods. Among the gods now there is no one who offers me assistance or oversees my actions or knows my mind. There is no one among the gods to whom I appeal. I live alone in the shivering, solitary knowledge that the time of the gods has passed. I am praying to no gods. I am alone among those here because I do not pray and will not pray again. Instead, I will speak in ordinary whispers. I will speak in words that come from the world, and those words will be filled with regret for what has been lost. I will make sounds like prayers, but prayers that have no source and no destination, not even a human one, since my daughter is dead and cannot hear. I know as no one else knows that the gods are distant. They have other concerns. They care about human desires and antics in the same way as I care about the leaves of a tree. I know the leaves are there. They wither and grow again and wither, as people come and live and then are replaced by others like them. There is nothing I can do to help them or prevent their withering. I do not deal with their desires. I wish now to stand here and laugh, hear me tittering and then howling with mirth at the idea that the gods allowed my husband to win his war, that they inspired every plan he worked out and every move he made, that they knew his cloudy moods in the morning and the strange and silly exhilaration he could exude at night, that they listened to his implorings and discussed them in their godly homes, that they watched the murder of my daughter with approval. The bargain was simple, or so he believed, or so his troops believed. Kill the innocent girl in return for a change in the wind. Take her out of the world. Use a knife on her flesh to ensure that she would never walk into a room again or wake in the morning again. Deprive the world of her grace. And as a reward, the gods would make the wind blow in her father's favor on the days he needed wind for his sails. They would hush the wind on the other days when his enemies needed it. The gods would make his men alert and brave and fill his enemies with fear. The gods would strengthen his swords and make them swift and sharp. When he was alive, he and the men around him believed that the gods followed their fates and cared about them, each of them. But I will say now that they did not. They do not. Our appeal to the gods is the same as the appeal a star makes in the sky above us before it falls. It is a sound we cannot hear, a sound to which even if we did hear it, we would be fully indifferent. The gods have their own unearthly concerns, unimagined by us. They barely know we are alive. For them, if they were to hear of us, we would be like the mild sound of wind in the trees, a distant, unpersistent, rustling sound. I know that it was not always thus. There was a time when the gods came in the morning to wake us, when they combed our hair and filled our mouths with the sweetness of speech and listened to our desires and tried to fulfill them for us, when they knew our minds and when they could send us signs. Not long ago, within our memories, the crying women could be heard in the night, in the time before death came. It was a way of calling the dying home, hastening their flight, softening their wavering journey to the place of rest. My husband was with me in the days before my mother died, and we both heard it, and my mother heard it too, and it comforted her that death was ready to lure her with its cries. That noise has stopped. There is no more crying like the wind. The dead fade in their own time. No one helps them, no one notices except those who have been close to them during their short spell in the world. As they fade from the earth, the gods do not hover over with their haunting, whistling sound. I notice it here, the silence around death. They have departed, they have gone and will not be back. My husband was lucky with the wind, that was all. And lucky his men were brave, and lucky that he prevailed. It could easily have been otherwise. He did not need to sacrifice our daughter to the gods. My nurse was with me from the time I was born. In her last days, we did not believe that she was dying. I sat with her, and we talked. If there had been the slightest sound of wailing, we would have heard. There was nothing. No sound to accompany her towards death. There was silence or the usual noises from the kitchen or the barking of dogs. And then she died. Then she stopped breathing. It was over for her. I went out and looked at the sky. And all I had then to help me was the leftover language of prayer. What had once been powerful and added meaning to everything was now desolate, strange, with its own sad, brittle power, with its memory locked in its rhythms of a vivid past when our words rose up and found completion. Now our words are trapped in time. They are filled with limits. They are mere distractions. They're as fleeting and monotonous as breath that keep us alive. And maybe that is something, at least for the moment, for which we should be grateful. There is nothing else. She's brought Orestes with her, and everybody thinks that he's been taken away at the time his sister is to be sacrificed. But in fact, he hears the sounds and he goes and looks and he witnesses it. And then later on, when his father has to be murdered, his mother, I think quite reasonably says, just get the boy out of the palace while I do this. I don't want him to know that his mother is doing this. And what actually happens is he's kidnapped and he's taken away. And he spends 10 years away with another boy. And eventually they come home. But Orestes, the son, he's more easily led. He's not a leader. He's a king's son, but he's more like Hamlet than he is like anybody else. In other words, that he finds it very difficult to make up his mind about anything. And this story is quite close to the story of Hamlet. Shakespeare took so much from this, of the idea of this young man in this palace whose father has been murdered, whose mother has taken a lover, and who's wandering uncertainly, great uncertainty and unease in the corridors. And once I thought of that, once I realized the connection, I realized that since that play is so much nourished by the presence of the ghost of Hamlet's father, that I could bring in a ghost too. And so what I'm trying to build up to is the moment in the book where Electra, who's in a rage against her mother, eggs on her brother Orestes, who has been away, to murder Clytemnestra when he returns. Thus the spiral of killings continues. And the problem I had with the book really was that once that was done, it was so shocking, the idea that this young man would murder his mother, that I couldn't think what to do with the next page. Like, would he go back to his room, or would he feel sorry, or would he want to kill someone else, or would he go drinking with his friends, or what I thought instead was, well, no, you turn the page and actually it's her ghost, that his mother's ghost comes now and begins to speak. And there are just two things, that she Clytemnestra is actually the daughter of Leda. That while Leda is the mother of Helen of Troy, because she was raped by the god Zeus, who came in the form of a swan, that the other children included Clytemnestra. And so she has this memory of her mother and the swan. But also she has a vague memory of how she died, that it was in a garden, with steps down to the garden. And but in the other cases where ghosts have appeared, the ghost of Agamemnon appears and the ghost of Iphigenia, they have no memory of how they were killed. They've come back into the world looking for something else, not revenge or not to go over what happened at the end of their lives, but looking for one more thing. So this is the ghost of Clytemnestra. There will come a time when the shadows fold in on me. I know that, but I'm awake now, or almost awake. I remember some things, outlines come to me, and the faint sound of voices. What linger most are traces of people, presences, sounds. Mostly I walk among the shades, but sometimes a hint of someone comes close, someone whose name I once knew, or whose voice and face were real to me. Someone I once loved, perhaps, I'm not sure. There's one remnant that comes and persists, however. It is my mother. At some time in the distant past, she is helpless, being held down. I can hear cries, her cries, and the shriller cries of a figure above her, or lying on her, and then louder cries as the figure flits away, a figure with a beak and wings, with the shape of wings, the wings beating in the air, and my mother lying breathless, whimpering. But I do not know what this means, or why it comes to me. I feel that if I remain still, something more will come. It is hard not to wander in these spaces when there is silence. There are presences I wish to encounter, presences that are close but not close enough to touch or be seen. I can think of the names, their names. I cannot think of the names, their names, and I cannot see faces clearly enough, although there are moments when I have been quiet, when I have made no effort for some time to remember or focus, moments when a face approaches, the face of someone I have known, but it fades before it becomes anyone I can recognize. I know that there was feeling, and that is the difference between where I am now and the place I was once. There was a time, I know, when I felt rage and I felt sorrow. But now I have lost what leads to rage and sorrow. Maybe the only reason I wander in these spaces has to do with some other feeling or what is left of it. Maybe that feeling is love. There is someone whom I love still, or have loved and protected. But I cannot be sure of that. No name will come. Some words come, but not the words I want, which are the names. If I can say the names, I will know then whom I loved, and I will find them, or know how to see them. I will lure them into the shadows when the time is right. No one in their world knows how little there is here. It is all blankness, strangeness, silence. Hardly anything moves. There are echoes like distant water flowing under rock, and then sometimes that sound comes nearer, but it is still faint. If I listen too eagerly, it disappears. Maybe there are things that did not come to an end when I was there, and they linger now like words that need to be said, or words that have escaped me and will come, or might come, or must come as I wait here. It will take time. I do not know how much time I have, or how much time there is, but I know that I must fade, that I cannot persist in this state. The fading will be gradual. By the end I will not know anything. What I am hoping for is one more surge, some hours or even moments, when I will go back into the world and settle into it briefly as though I were alive. In the meantime there's memory, which connects and attaches and withdraws. It is almost something. A vague thought hovers, but it is never stable. Like a figure with wings, it edges towards what has been or was. I live on the inside of what has substance. I can feel some large set of pressing desires brushing past. All I am left with, though, are the great traces, the clues. This must be what shadow is like, or aftermath. Some lines or shapes that must have made sense at one time, or may still make sense but seem random now. If only I could follow what their intention was, or whisper to whoever made them. That desire is the closest I have come to pure feeling, and it is not close at all. I will be left here for the hours or days or years I have been allotted, no longer than that. Being perplexed and bewildered replaces truth and knowledge, replaces what is real and tangible. The space I inhabit is like a sad gift that was offered, but will soon be withdrawn. And then a word occurred to me, a word of which I was sure. It was the word dream. Once the word came, I knew what dream was or had been, and I was certain then that I was not dreaming in this nullness, that none of what is happening is dream. It is real, it is actual. And then other words appeared like stars in the darkening sky. I became desperate to take possession of each one, but I could not hold on to them. They were falling or glittering or moving further away. It was enough, however, to have seen them to get some idea of their power and know that some of them would return, and like the light from a full moon on a dark night, become part of a shadowy stability that was guiding me. I walked in the corridors of that palace where I had once lived. I could almost remember some things that had happened. There was an image of someone in a garden or on steps that led to a garden, staring hard, breathing hard, but then nothing. Just stillness in the garden. And then there was not even a garden, there was merely a space. But I was still awake, I was waiting, knowing that there would be change, that it would not always be like this. I was aware how easy it would be once I was in those corridors again for one of the guards to notice me if I made a sound or if I moved quickly so that there would be some disturbance in the air. And then slowly I began to understand why I was here and who I was looking for. His name did not come to me, and I was not able to picture his face, but I felt that he was close. I could imagine the guard who had seen me or who had noticed my presence, consulting one of the other guards, and then both of them approaching him, the one I am searching for, or his friend who looks after him. My husband is dead, and my daughter, they have become pure shade. My other daughter is here, but the one I am searching for is my son. I'm awake. The words I knew are sleeping. Sometimes they turn in the night or make some sound in their vast dreaming, and then they wake too. Often, if only for a second, they open their eyes and watch me. I hold their gaze so that they might remember me as they fall back into sleep. I study them then in their inert state. I'm alert to any movement they make. I can hear their dark groanings in the night, intermittent against their breathing. I can see them reach their arms towards me to be lifted. I can tell the difference between night and day now. I know that silence descends on the gardens and the corridors at night, a silence broken only by the soft movements of the guards or of cats. This is my realm, where I am free to wander. As I come from the garden, I'm aware that the guards can feel a movement in the air. It would just take one more thing to let them know that I'm with them. A sound, a darting gesture. When the time came, I knew that I would hear his name, my son's name, enough to whisper it, like someone imploring. It would come to me when I needed it. Orestes, I whispered on one of those nights, and then I withdrew into the shadows. Orestes, I repeated, letting my voice echo down the corridor. I saw two of the guards running back and forth, and then summoning the other one, my son's friend, who strutted up and down, checking doorways and corridors. I waited until he had gone, and then I whispered to one of the guards, "Tell Orestes that I am his mother. He must come alone into the corridor. He must be alone." The guard made as though to run, but then stopped himself. "Speak again," he said quietly, his head bowed. "Tell Orestes to come alone," I said. "Now?" he asked. "Soon. Orestes must come soon." "Do you mean to cause him harm?" "No, I do not mean to cause him harm." Thank you.
Real quick, three-part question. When did you first read the Theban plays? What language did you read them in, or what translation? And why did you decide to build a novel on it? What was the time and the circumstance?
I would think I saw Electra performed before I read it. And I probably also knew the Richard Strauss opera before I read it. And But what I hadn't read ever was the late play by Euripides called Iphigenia in Aulis. It's a terrible title for a play. If only he'd called it something else, I would have read it. I mean, Electra is such a great title for a play. And so that it was only then, I think it was when Anne Carson's translation came out, with that extraordinary introduction that is so smart, that I noticed the reference to the play. And then I would have probably read Robert Fagel's, because I was teaching in Princeton and he had been there, and I was certainly alert to other translations he'd made. And then I would have read that long introduction to the Fagel's translation. And this particularly mentioned Iphigenia in Aulis. And I thought, I don't know what age I am, I can't remember anymore, but I thought I really must go and read this. But it really is an eye-opener, because it gives you the whole thing. I mean, up to then, Clytemnestra gets a bad deal. Once Electra appears on the stage in all her rage, all her certainty, all her outsiderness, her mother becomes this pale figure in the palace, just waiting to be murdered, making vague excuses for herself, trying to deal with her lover, Aegisthus. But in this play, it's told from the point of view of Clytemnestra. I mean, it isn't that Clytemnestra gets great speeches, but it is as though our sympathy moves over to her, and it is as though Euripides, at the end of his life, was almost worried, perhaps, that that she had got a raw deal, and that he wanted to rectify this. And really, once I read that, I realized that something could be done with Clytemnestra, where she could be given a voice in the same way as, say, Antigone, Medea, or Electra, that she could actually speak without being interrupted for about 70 pages of a book. The problem was what to do then. And but then, of course, what you're always looking for, in a way, is the blurred figure in the picture, is what's missing. And in a way, for me, what was missing in the story that I knew for so long was the conscience of Clytemnestra, or Clytemnestra's determination, or her figure at the center of things. But what's also missing, richly missing, is the figure of Orestes. Where is he when he's away? He returns. We know he returns. There's a whole scene with the lock of the hair, and he's appearing, and Electra waiting for him. Where has he been? And once that's in nodes, I looked for a source for that. Maybe there's someone here who knows, but I couldn't find any scholar who could write with certainty, where is Orestes? And that began to intrigue me. So then I could start working with the idea that at the time of his father's murder, he was kidnapped. And then once I started to work with that, of course, I went back to Irish mythology and the figure of Cuchulainn, these sort of boy warriors wandering through the landscape. And when Cuchulainn actually kills a dog, who's the great guard dog, and the man who owns the guard dog says, "I've no one to guard me now." He says, "I will guard you. I will be your guard dog." So the word "cu" actually is an old Irish word for dog. And this happens in the book. And Orestes and his friends stay with this old woman on the edge of the sea, almost like something from a folk tale, for 10 years. Until the old woman dies and one of their friends die, and they return. And then they walk back across the landscape, not knowing what has happened at home. And then it all begins again, because Electra has plans for Orestes when he returns. She's just waiting for him. And his mother also, of course, wants him to be there. But everyone's watching everybody. Aegisthus, the mother's lover, is watching. Everybody wants something, but poor Orestes is the one who has no strategy. All the others are working out a strategy, and Orestes is caught between them. And once I started to work that out, I realized that I had a book that actually something I could work with. Because in a contemporary novel, if you want to try and get somebody who's not a psychopath to murder his mother, you want to start early. You have to give him, in other words, you have to give him a lot of psychological texture to build up to that moment. I mean, I did have moments where I thought, oh God, I'd give anything to be an ancient Greek, where I could simply have Clytemnestra going off stage, Orestes following her with a knife, sounds of shouting off stage and screaming, and then Orestes coming back on with a knife. And that would be, oh God, yeah, he must have killed his mother while off stage. But a novel, you just can't do that. I mean, it's such a pity. You have to, that the whole idea of why did he murder his mother? What was he doing the day before? What did he do the day after? Did that have roots in his childhood? So you have to sort of go back very far. And so I realized it wasn't that I could do a retelling of the story, as much as that I could find things that were not in the story, and I could adapt them or graft them on to the methods of a contemporary novel. And so that's really what I was doing.
Thank you. Did you study any connection to the Hebrew Bible, the Book of Judges, and Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter to fulfill a vow that he made to God to win a battle?
I mean, I was not particularly that story, but I was aware of that whole idea in the Old Testament of sacrificing a child, of that being there in the Old Testament, and but not that particular. Not that particular. I don't know what word to use. Story or aspect of the Old Testament. No, I didn't. No.
I wonder if you're familiar with Riane Eisler's The Chalice and the Blade, which discusses underlying pagan religions in which women had spiritual authority compared to what happened in Greece with the child sacrifice and a lot of the Old Testament, and the tension between spiritual leadership by each gender.
I don't know that book, and I actually I must write it down. What's it called again? The Chalice and the Blade. Thank you. I wish I had. It's a good title. But the in the I was talking about Irish mythology. For example, in the Toibin, which is, I suppose, our version, which is our sort of, I suppose, most famous mythological book, the Irish one, Queen Maeve does dominate, and it is Queen Maeve who decides what will occur. And she really is capricious, and she really is quite violent, and she's quite sort of also sexually open. And but I think that figure of in Irish mythology would be the figure of the Cailleach, meaning the old woman who has a certain sort of power that comes from a mystical relationship, either to landscape or to time, and has much more power than men. While men go to war, she will stay home and weave, or she will stay home and speak, or she will stay home and guard a certain thing that needs to be guarded, and one must attend to her speech. And I was certainly alert to that to some extent when I wrote the Testament of Mary. I was working with the same sort of ideas. But so that it happens twice in the book. I mean, first in the case of Clytemnestra herself, that she carries with her once she has been, in a way, betrayed, in that she can actually decide what to do. That she becomes this immensely powerful figure who could be from out of Coriolanus or out of Boadicea or Margaret Thatcher. That she could be, that she has the corner office, and but on the other hand, the old woman that the boys are with for those 10 years can hear anything coming in on the wind. She knows everything that's happening. I mean, there's a sense of her of knowing the past and the future. She knows the story of Helen of Troy as story, even though it has recently occurred. And she knows, oddly enough, the story of the children of Lir, which is the most beautiful of the Irish folk tales, which is the story of the 4 children who were turned into swans and let roam the earth for 900 years. And they came back eventually and landed from where they had set off. And all the wings fell away in the beaks, and they were just 900 years old. So that she knows that story. She knows the story of Helen of Troy. The other thing I was using was Wagner's The Ring, the sequence especially in Siegfried, when Wotan goes to find one of his earlier wives, who's Erda, who's living in the earth. She's in a vast sleep in the earth, and he wakes her. In one of the productions I saw, he actually rings an apartment bell, and she comes down on the elevator. Which, I mean, God, they really will do anything. But in any case, recently in the Met in New York, she's the great Irish mezzo Patricia Barden. But she's the mezzo or the contralto. She has the deep, deep voice of truth, and she tells him. I mean, it takes 45 minutes, but she does tell him very effectively that the time of the gods is waning, that it's over. Does he not know that it's over? And I was using that idea also of her, of all along, of there being a figure sort of underneath the story who sort of knows, who has a certain knowledge that Agamemnon doesn't have, or that Orestes certainly doesn't have.
What did it do for you to spend so much time in the mindset of someone so violent while you were writing the novel?
The first book I wrote was called Bad Blood, A Walk Along the Irish Border. And I wrote that book in 1986. And when I came to the end of the book, I was in South Armagh on the eastern side of the border. And I went to a town called Bessbrook, just north of the border on the northern side. And I sat in the village green for about an hour, wishing I didn't have to do what I now had to do, because I was a reporter. And I had to knock on 2 doors. And what had happened, Seamus Heaney invokes it in his Nobel speech as the most harrowing event in the harrowing business of the Northern Irish Troubles. But in January 1976, 12 men were coming home from work in a minibus. So it was dark in the evening. And they were stopped. They thought it was the British Army. It was not. They didn't know who it was, but the men had guns. There were 11 Protestants among them and 1 Catholic. And the men said the 1 Catholic must stand out. Somehow they knew there was 1 Catholic. And at first they tried to shield him. But eventually he stood out. And he was told to run. And they shot the other 11. And 1 survived from the 11. And his name was Alan Black. And I knocked on his door, and I thank God he wasn't there. And I went over to the other house where the 1 Catholic was still living there. And he was like a walking ghost. And he came to the door and said, "Oh no, I've never spoken about it ever in my life." And just as he was closing the door, he did need for me to know one thing. He said, "Those men were my friends." Protestant Catholic wasn't the issue. They were my friends. And then I thought, one question: did you think they were going to shoot you? And he looked at me as though it was yesterday, or as though it was now. What would you have thought? And then he closed the door. And then I went back to the other house where Alan Black was now home. And he brought me in. He was a Protestant who had survived. And he brought me in. I was a Catholic from the south. He brought me into his house. And he sat me down and said, "I don't want to talk about it. But there's a TV documentary, and I've never watched it. It was made for the 10th anniversary. If you want to watch it here, I'll put it on for you. But I'm not staying in the room." He put it on for me, and he meant to go, but he didn't. Ended up the 2 of us watching it. And him watching the story, what had happened to him as story, with him trying to describe what it was like to wriggle out of those bodies, knowing that he was the only one alive. And that we started to talk, and we spent the evening talking. We went out in the countryside for a drive, and we went out to see his son, who was learning to drive. And he said it was heartbreaking seeing that the children of all the men who were killed were growing up in Bestbrook, and you could see them going to school and coming from school every day. So, I'd had those sort of stories. I mean, I come from a country that has had a civil war twice in the 20th century. And my uncle was involved in the first civil war and was interned during that civil war. So that whole idea of what happens when there's an intimate war, when a country closes in on itself, is something I know about. And obviously, when I was writing this book, Syria was happening. But those Irish things were particularly on my mind, and were close, and remain close, because also what we must remember, we don't know who did those killings. They were never charged. No one was ever charged or arrested. They're probably still alive. They're probably in their 60s or 70s, and they're probably have families of their own, and they're probably living close by. And that is the case with so many of those sort of atrocities in Northern Ireland, that that most people who did them got away. And I mean, while there were many people arrested and people charged, many people were not. But particularly for that one, we don't know who did it. But it has to have been a local. They have to have been local to have known about the 11 Protestants, 1 Catholic. And people must pass them in the street sometimes. And so that's one of the reasons why this, in a way, was a way for me just to work out some of that, to dramatize it, to find a metaphor for it, to find a myth for it.
I find myself wondering, as I read the book, why in those 10 years Electra didn't kill her mother. Do you have a sense of why she waited for her brother to come back?
Yes, he wonders that himself later on, that she got him to do something that she herself would not do. That, in other words, that there's a battle going on between those who take their orders from the gods and those who take their orders from their own decisions. And Electra is wavering between the two. She simply realizes that if she does that, for example, Aegisthus is there all the time, but that a woman murdering her own mother will be ostracized even further than Orestes is ostracized. I mean, when Orestes murders his mother, he's simply cast aside. In the play, he's pursued by the Furies. In my book, he's simply, no one wants anything to do with him. People don't want him in the room with them. And it's a sort of silence, it's a sort of ostracization, so that she simply does not have the courage to do it. And she waits for him. And oddly enough, even though he seems not to have courage, and he doesn't have courage, he has no strategy, but he's someone who will, as it says in the novel, under certain circumstances, he will do anything, including his sister's will, so that she simply waits for him to come back, knowing that she can use him as her foil, as her tool, as her method, as her weapon, in a way. And that's all he is at a certain point. He is simply a weapon that his sister uses to murder the mother. And while Electra continues to flourish afterwards and joins forces with the others to sort of run the country, Orestes is the one who withdraws into the shadows, so that she knows what will happen to someone who commits matricide. And she's ready to sacrifice her brother for that purpose, but not herself.
It seems to me that you quite frequently and very effectively tell stories from the point of view of a woman. How did you decide that you could do this so well? What precipitated that?
I wish I could tell you it was a decision. I think in the novels like Brooklyn and Nora Webster, I was trying to get back a world that had just gone, of my mother and her 2 sisters and my father's sister, and they had died just before I began those 2 books, and I was trying to work a way of just remembering, I mean, it's a particular time, and the way women spoke, and I've probably said this before, but it would have been difficult to have invoked the men. I mean, other than in a sort of Beckett play, Endgame or something. I mean, that the men tended to be grumpy, and they were downstairs, and they were often just talking about sport. And a man would say that there was a good goal on Sunday in that match. Another man could say that he thought the second goal was good as well, and they could agree on that. I would be a little boy, sort of watching them, thinking, "Is anyone going to say anything interesting?" And then I would go upstairs to see what was going on, and my mother and her two aunts would be discussing a coat that my Auntie Harriet nearly bought in Dublin, and it was green, and the buttons were lovely, and there was a lovely thing about it, and my Auntie Maeve would say, "But why didn't you buy it? And could you still? And was it on a sale?" And then my mother would say, and then my mother they would decide to swap clothes. And my mother would go to my mother's wardrobe, looking at something that they might wear for some event or other. And I don't know why it was so interesting, but it was absolutely beyond belief in it. And then eventually they would put you out of the room because they would want to talk about something, and they'd realize that I was just listening too much. And they would say, "Go outside now." And then every so often you'd, "Now, can I come back in?" And say, "No." And then you could come back in, but you'd never want to go back downstairs because it'd still be saying that there was a young player coming up who's good. And they would say his brother was a good player. Yes, this is unbearable. And but with this and with the Testament of Mary, I was working out of an idea about the relationship between power and powerlessness in voice. That, in other words, the more powerless the figure is, the more powerful the voice can be. It is. In a way, Antigone is slightly like what I've been saying. That Creon, when he talks, it's like legislation. He's like a member of. Well, I was going to say he's like a member of Congress, but let's not go there just now. He's like somebody who's passing legislation. And his speech does not have great texture. But when Antigone appears, she's all texture, it's all heightened tone, and you can't take your eyes off her. And part of that arises from her powerlessness. That actually makes somehow or other what's been held in, once released, has an enormous power and effect. And so too I felt with Mary in the New Testament, that her silence, the fact that Jesus is constantly preaching, or he's got loads of parables and things, he's got loads to say generally. And I mean, I've nothing against that. But she is the figure in iconography. She's the grieving mother, or she's the young mother. But what would happen if she spoke? What would happen if she got to say something? What would that sound like? And so I was sort of working out of those ideas about a sort of submerged consciousness, a sort of sense that if you speak, it might only be once, and you better say it all, because you might not get another chance. Somebody will silence you. So I was working out of that idea.
Could you talk a little bit about the difference between writing a story purely from imagination and, like in this novel and in The Testament of Mary, building off of a myth or a story that already exists?
Yeah, I mean, I think with this book, I was using I certainly had the Euripides close to me all the time for that first section. And then I realized that the Electra plays were no use to me, that because I had brought the mother up so much, the daughter had to move further into the shadows and become a sort of strange, at times she's like Ophelia, or at times she's also involved with sort of spider-like sort of strategy of how she's going to do things. But all the Orestes sections were completely taken from imagination. And I was using a lot of, I had been in Southern California walking in the desert. So those walks are entirely me walking along, trudging along in the desert, wondering if this will ever end. And with that section, that last section I read, I've absolutely no idea where it came from, in the sense that it isn't sort of needed in the book, except, as I explained, I couldn't think what to do once Clytemnestra is killed by her own son. But it was written very, very quickly. It was probably written in a day or two, as though I'd been waiting to write it all along, and it was there somewhere. Although I hesitate to talk like that. I mean, writing is deliberate. It's not a form of magic. It's not mystical. But I think I was working out very personal things in that, about my own mother being dead, and about the whole idea of that. But that came very, very easily. I didn't need any source of anything open except Hamlet, where there is a line, "Speak again," is what one of the guards says to Hamlet's father's ghost. I put it in as just a little gesture. "Speak again," is what the message. But I was trying to imagine, in order not to imagine myself, because I thought I don't want to. This is not autobiography. I was trying to imagine Hamlet, actually Hamlet, in that moment when he sees his father's ghost. And he actually realizes it is his father's ghost. What that might have been like for him. So I had Hamlet beside me, just looking at the ghost scene, that I think is the third, just quite early in the play. But I didn't use it much, except for that "Speak again" line. And then sometimes I did. There are loads of details. She takes a lover, Aegisthus, and so in the play she just takes a lover. But of course, in a modern novel, even though it's set in ancient Greece, the novel, I still had to have, how do you take a lover? It's always slow. You can't just take a lover. It happens. One night you haven't taken him, and the next night you have. So what actually occurs? So I just started to both imagine and use experience. In that moment where you wonder, will they or won't they? How it might go over the next hour or two. I don't know. I don't want to question you personally, but you seem to be nodding anyway. So I had to sort of use all of that, and I think no matter what you do, you're always going back into something you remember, or something, is there anything I can use here that I know? And then going back to the text to see, okay, what can I do next? But then how can I put flesh onto that? And sometimes the only way to do that is to go back into memory, or at least go back into feeling, seeing how would that feel for somebody. And then once you do that, you're almost using things that you know yourself, or have felt yourself. So, okay, thank you very much.